It was an ordinary weekday night in a suburban part of Houston, a place where most residents expected nothing more than the hum of air conditioners and the occasional passing car. Neighbors described the area as calm, with children playing outside in the evenings and parents returning from work to quiet homes. That sense of normal life was shattered when police sirens cut through the streets, converging on the Wright household. Inside, officers faced a scene they later said was unlike anything they had encountered in such a neighborhood. The body of Michael Wright was found in a bedroom, tied to the bed with bindings on his wrists and ankles. He had been stabbed dozens of times. The silence of the house contrasted with the violence of what lay before them. The first responders tried to take in what they were seeing while securing the scene. One officer noted that the number of stab wounds was shocking, not just because of the violence but because of the suggestion of time and repeated action. The bindings around Michael's body made the investigators stop and consider whether this was a struggle, an act of passion, or something that had been set up in advance. Blood had spread across the bedding and the floor, leaving a trail that seemed to tell its own story, though not one that was immediately clear. The suburban setting made the event harder to process, as residents stood outside their homes watching, unable to believe that such an act had taken place among them. Detectives arrived quickly, beginning the first phase of the investigation by documenting the room, the condition of the body, and any objects that might explain what had taken place. They spoke quietly among themselves, noting how unusual it was to see restraints used in a domestic case. They also noted that while many homicides involve heated arguments or sudden fights, this scene suggested a level of control that did not fit with the typical profile of an impulsive act. The fact that the couple's 2 children were in the home that night added another layer of concern, as officers tried to account for their safety and what they might have seen or heard. News of the crime spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors described the Wrights as a family that blended in, not one that drew attention for disputes or loud conflicts. Some remembered Michael as friendly and hardworking, while others recalled seeing Susan with the children at local events. No one expected the police to arrive in force or to hear that a husband had been killed in such a brutal manner behind the closed doors of that house. For detectives, the challenge was to separate outward appearances from what might have been taking place privately. As the body was moved and the evidence collected, questions began to form. Who had bound Michael to the bed and when? How could someone inflict so many wounds without interruption? Why was there no clear sign of an intruder, forced entry, or robbery? These were the first observations, but none of them yet explained motive. Detectives were careful not to jump to conclusions, but they recognized that the scene carried elements of planning rather than random violence. Still, until statements were taken and forensic results returned, every possibility had to remain open. The medical examiner's early notes confirmed what police already suspected. The number of stab wounds was high, and the attack had lasted long enough to suggest determination rather than a single moment of panic. The restraints told their own part of the story, making investigators consider whether the victim had been overpowered, willingly restrained, or placed in that position by force. These details would later fuel arguments in court, but at the start they only deepened the mystery. The line between crime of passion and calculated act was not yet clear, and every detail could point in either direction. Detectives interviewed Susan Wright, who was in the house, and tried to understand her version of events. They recorded her initial statements while carefully noting inconsistencies and areas needing follow-up. At the same time, they spoke with family members and neighbors to build a clearer picture of what the Wright household was like in the weeks and months leading to that night. Early accounts suggested that while the family appeared typical on the outside, tensions had existed inside. How deep those tensions ran, and whether they played a role in Michael's death, was something the investigators would soon explore. The crime scene also raised difficult questions about how love and trust can coexist with violence. Detectives commented among themselves that this was not just another domestic case. The act of restraining a person and stabbing them repeatedly implied an intensity that disturbed even seasoned officers. For them, the issue was not only solving a murder but also understanding how a relationship that once included marriage and children had come to end in such brutality. They did not yet know if they were dealing with a case of sudden violence, years of hidden conflict, or something else altogether. By the end of that first night, the house was sealed, evidence bags filled, and reports drafted, but answers remained scarce. The investigators were left with photographs of a family home that had turned into a crime scene and a body that showed the extent of violence few expected in such a setting. The shock carried through the department as word spread, and it became clear that the investigation would draw more than routine attention. Detectives already sensed that this case would not be simple, that the explanation would involve more than one layer, and that the truth might remain unsettled even after a trial. From that quiet neighborhood to the violent bedroom scene, the story of Michael Wright's death was only beginning to unfold. The next step for detectives was to look beyond the crime scene and into the lives of Susan and Michael, to see how a marriage that once appeared steady could end in bloodshed. It was in that search, through stories of their relationship and accounts from those who knew them, that the picture of love turning to fear and shadows began to take shape. In the days after Michael Wright's death, detectives turned their focus away from the bedroom crime scene and toward the history of his marriage with Susan. On paper, the couple seemed to embody suburban stability. They were young parents with 2 children, a boy and a girl, building a home together in Houston. Family photographs showed vacations, birthdays, and smiling faces that appeared to tell a simple story of love and family life. Friends and neighbors initially described them as a normal couple, active in their community, with no obvious sign that their household carried hidden turmoil. For investigators, however, the surface picture was only a starting point. As detectives interviewed those who had known the Wrights, different accounts began to appear. Some recalled Michael as a charismatic man who enjoyed social gatherings and seemed comfortable in almost any setting. Susan, by contrast, was described as more reserved, quieter, and deeply focused on her children. Early impressions of their relationship painted them as a balanced pair, complementing each other's personalities. But as investigators asked more questions, the stories became less consistent. Behind the compliments came mentions of arguments, of tension, and of moments when the relationship appeared strained. Reports of control and anger emerged in fragments. A few acquaintances remembered Michael as sometimes short-tempered, especially at home. Some said Susan had confided in them about being frightened during arguments, though these comments were often vague and not followed by details. Others remembered seeing Susan with unexplained bruises, though no one could confirm how they had been caused. For detectives, each piece was small, but together they suggested a marriage that may not have been as peaceful as it looked from the outside. At the same time, different voices defended Michael. Friends described him as hardworking, a devoted father, and a man who never spoke of problems at home. Some questioned whether Susan exaggerated or staged her claims, pointing to her tendency to withdraw from social life and her apparent mood swings. Detectives noted that these conflicting statements made it difficult to separate fact from speculation. They had to record each version carefully, knowing that every claim could later be challenged in court. Investigators also looked at Susan's behavior during interviews. They described her as soft-spoken and sometimes tearful, particularly when speaking about the children. She told detectives she had lived with fear for years, that Michael had been violent and controlling, and that his behavior had escalated over time. According to her, the final night had been the breaking point of years of abuse. These were serious allegations, and detectives knew they had to test them against physical evidence, medical records, and any witness who might have observed the marriage more closely. The case files began to reflect 2 very different portraits. One was of a mother trapped in a cycle of intimidation, trying to protect herself and her children. The other was of a wife who might have created a story to justify an act that detectives feared was premeditated. Neither portrait yet matched all the facts. The process of sorting through these competing images became central to the investigation. Detectives reminded themselves that personal accounts, while powerful, could be shaped by memory, loyalty, or personal interest. As the inquiry deepened, patterns from the Wright household emerged that seemed to sit between these 2 versions. Some friends described periods when Susan withdrew, avoiding contact with others, which could fit the picture of someone living in fear. At other times, they remembered her speaking warmly about Michael, appearing content and proud of her family. investigators began to consider whether the relationship shifted dramatically between highs and lows, with moments of affection mixed with sudden conflict. This possibility complicated the search for a single explanation. By looking at credit card records, phone logs, and daily routines, detectives tried to trace the rhythms of the Wright household. They noted normal expenses like groceries, school supplies, and household bills. Nothing immediately suggested the financial stress that sometimes drives conflict. Yet emotional stress, unlike financial records, left little trace on paper. Detectives recognized that the heart of the case might rest more on testimony and interpretation than on clear, documented facts. This realization would shape how the prosecution and defense later built their arguments. In interviews, the couple's children were too young to provide clear accounts of their parents' relationship, and investigators decided to limit their exposure to questioning. Without their direct testimony, the weight fell on adults who often disagreed about what they had seen or heard. Some insisted Susan's fear was genuine, others suggested she used it to excuse her actions. For detectives, the task was not to decide who was right but to gather as many accounts as possible before handing the evidence to the legal system. By the time detectives finished this phase of their work, the once simple image of a happy marriage had fractured into competing stories. The surface calm of suburban family life no longer explained what had happened behind closed doors. The investigation now pointed toward a relationship where love had turned into conflict, though whether that conflict justified the events of the fatal night remained unresolved. With those doubts growing, detectives turned back to the night of Michael Wright's death itself, to reconstruct exactly what had happened and why. On the night of Michael Wright's death, police and prosecutors began piecing together a timeline that quickly revealed gaps and contradictions. The call for help came late, but by the time officers arrived, Michael was already dead, tied to the bed with restraints on his wrists and ankles. Susan Wright told investigators that what had taken place was the final act in a long history of abuse. She said Michael had attacked her, and that she had defended herself in a struggle that spiraled out of control. This was her version of events, and it became the foundation of her defense from the very beginning. Detectives, however, were struck by details that seemed inconsistent with her account. According to Susan, the violence started after an argument that escalated into physical assault. She claimed that Michael pinned her down and that she grabbed a knife to stop him. She insisted she acted out of fear for her life. Yet when investigators looked at the evidence in the bedroom, they noted how methodical it seemed. The bindings on Michael's body suggested he had been tied down before or during the attack. For prosecutors, this detail pointed to planning, not panic. 40 stab wounds, they argued, was far more than a desperate act of survival. As statements were collected, investigators tried to line up the timeline. Susan said the attack lasted minutes, a blur of fear and reaction. Prosecutors countered that the number of wounds indicated much more time. They pointed out that stabbing someone repeatedly requires both physical effort and sustained action. They believed the crime scene showed signs of control, not frenzy. Detectives measured blood patterns and noted the absence of signs that Susan had been injured that night, which made them question her version of an uncontrollable struggle. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, began preparing to show how abuse can shape perception and response. They argued that Susan's account of years of intimidation explained why she reacted with such force. From their perspective, the restraints could have been improvised during the fight or evidence misinterpreted by police. They pointed to the possibility that Michael had been violent before and that Susan finally reached a breaking point. Their job was to show that what seemed deliberate could, under the weight of trauma, have been an act of survival. The investigators also looked at what happened immediately after Michael's death. Susan had not called 911 right away. Instead, she reached out to her family later, which raised more suspicion for the prosecution. They argued that her delay was a sign of calculation, a pause to consider how to explain what had happened. The defense countered that trauma can leave people disoriented, unable to think clearly in the aftermath of violence. Both sides were already shaping the same facts into very different stories. The silence of the house that night weighed heavily on the case. The children were in another room, and investigators found no sign that they had witnessed the violence. Prosecutors argued that this showed Susan acted while the children slept, taking advantage of the quiet. The defense suggested the opposite, saying Susan's restraint was evidence that her focus was survival, not staging a crime. Detectives noted how much hinged on interpretation rather than undisputed evidence. Interviews with neighbors added little clarity. Some said they heard nothing unusual that night, no shouting or prolonged noise. Prosecutors believed this supported their theory of a planned act, carried out in silence. Defense attorneys suggested it showed the attack happened quickly, with no time for neighbors to react. In either case, the absence of sound became a key point in the puzzle. As the medical examiner finalized the report, the details only deepened the divide. The wounds were numerous, consistent with sustained stabbing. The restraints were firmly tied, not loose. To prosecutors, this confirmed their belief that Susan had prepared for what she did. To the defense, it could still be explained as a chaotic response to years of abuse. The official report did not assign motive, leaving the interpretation to the courtroom. By the time investigators had finished reconstructing the night, they had two competing timelines. One suggested a woman who defended herself after years of hidden violence. The other suggested a calculated plan to end her husband's life in a controlled and deliberate way. The truth, if it could be pinned down, lay somewhere between those extremes. For detectives, the crime scene spoke volumes, but it did not answer the most important question. Why? With the evidence collected and the contradictions documented, the case moved beyond the walls of the Wright home. The next step would be for investigators to replay the night in even greater detail, tracing each wound, each restraint, and each movement to test the competing stories. It was at this stage, as detectives reconstructed the horror, that the question of motive became central. Detectives now turned to the careful work of reconstructing the night of Michael Wright's death step by step. The crime scene had been photographed, measured, and logged, but the meaning of each detail required methodical review. Investigators examined the bindings on Michael's wrists and ankles, noting how tightly they were secured. The knots were firm, not rushed, which raised questions about when and how they had been tied. They also charted the location of bloodstains across the room, following the splatter and pooling to create a possible sequence of events. The goal was to determine whether the evidence supported Susan's account of a sudden fight or the prosecution's suspicion of deliberate planning. The sheer number of stab wounds dominated the reconstruction. Michael had been stabbed around 40 times, each wound documented by the medical examiner. Detectives studied the pattern of the injuries, noting their concentration on the chest and neck. Some appeared deeper and more forceful than others, suggesting sustained effort. Investigators asked whether this was consistent with a frantic defense, as Susan claimed, or whether it reflected a prolonged attack. The medical examiner's notes did not state motive, but the extent of the injuries stood as a physical record that detectives could not ignore. Attention then turned to the sequence of restraint. Susan's version described a struggle in which she fought back while being attacked. Yet detectives questioned how Michael could have ended up bound to the bed if the event unfolded as she described. To them, the order of events mattered. Had he been restrained before the stabbing began, or during it? They examined the position of the body and the bindings, looking for signs of resistance that might confirm or challenge her statement. The lack of evidence showing Michael had freed himself or attempted to break loose weighed against the idea of a sudden, chaotic fight. The room itself offered further clues. Blood on the walls and floor suggested movement, but the patterns indicated limited struggle. For detectives, this supported the idea of control rather than frenzy. A fight of the kind Susan described would likely have caused wider disruption, with furniture overturned or more signs of disorder. Instead, the scene appeared contained. Investigators considered whether this containment was the result of quick, efficient action or whether it pointed to planning that limited the chances of escape. These interpretations would later become key arguments at trial. Detectives also reviewed Susan's injuries, or lack thereof. Medical staff who examined her shortly after the incident found no serious wounds. This absence raised further doubts for prosecutors, who argued that a woman defending herself against a violent assault would likely show some physical marks. The defense countered that not all abuse leaves visible injuries and that fear, not fresh wounds, drove Susan's actions that night. Still, for detectives seeking to reconstruct the timeline, her physical condition complicated her claim of self-defense. The soundscape of the night added another layer of uncertainty. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. For detectives, this suggested the attack was either brief and controlled or muffled in ways that prevented detection. The silence of the house, combined with the fact that the children were asleep in another room, made the reconstruction difficult. It left investigators wondering how such an extended act of violence could occur without drawing attention. Once again, the absence of evidence could be read in different ways. As the evidence was laid out in reports, detectives realized they were dealing with more than a domestic dispute turned violent. The bindings, the number of wounds, and the order of events pointed toward control as a central factor. Whether that control was the product of years of tension reaching its end or of deliberate calculation remained the core dispute. For detectives, the reconstruction suggested that passion alone did not explain the scene. Something more structured seemed to have guided the actions in that bedroom. Interviews with family and friends added context but not clarity. Some said Michael had been violent before, which could support Susan's version. Others insisted they had never seen signs of abuse, strengthening the prosecution's theory of premeditation. Detectives logged these accounts carefully, knowing that the case was not only about what happened physically, but about how people interpreted the couple's relationship. Still, the physical evidence, the bindings and the wounds, anchored their reconstruction more firmly than any testimony. By the end of their review, investigators summarized the scene as one of brutality contained within control. The number of wounds, the presence of restraints, and the silence of the house all pointed away from a momentary outburst. To detectives, the crime seemed to involve choices made during the act, not just reactions to sudden fear. Yet they also acknowledged that their reconstruction could not fully answer questions about motive or intent. Those matters, they knew, would be contested in the courtroom. With the crime scene reconstructed, the investigation shifted from evidence gathering to presentation. Detectives prepared to hand over their findings, aware that the interpretation of every detail would now rest with lawyers and jurors. The next stage would become a trial by storytelling, with prosecution and defense each shaping the same facts into narratives of either calculation or survival. In the courtroom, the case of Susan Wright turned into a battle over how to interpret the same set of facts. The prosecution opened with a narrative of calculation. They described Susan as a woman who bound her husband to a bed, then stabbed him repeatedly with deliberation. Each wound, they argued, was not random but part of a sequence. The restraints, in their view, proved intent and control. They told the jury that what happened in the Wright home was not a desperate act of survival but a carefully planned killing. This version of events framed Susan as someone who rehearsed her actions and carried them out without interruption. The defense, by contrast, told a different story. They portrayed Susan as a battered wife who had endured years of abuse, much of it hidden from public view. They argued that fear and trauma shaped her behavior, and that the stabbing was the final act of self-defense against a husband who had long controlled and hurt her. In this narrative, the number of wounds reflected panic, not planning. The restraints, they suggested, may have been improvised or misunderstood, a detail amplified by investigators but not conclusive of intent. For the defense, Susan's tears and her testimony about fear for her life were central to understanding what had taken place. Jurors listened to these conflicting accounts as evidence was introduced. Photographs of the bedroom were shown, the restraints displayed, and the medical examiner testified about the extent of Michael's wounds. The prosecution emphasized the images, arguing that 40 stab wounds showed determination far beyond what self-defense required. The defense countered that trauma does not follow mathematical limits, that a victim in fear cannot be expected to stop at a certain number of blows once violence begins. This clash over interpretation ran through every witness and exhibit. Witnesses added their own pieces to the competing narratives. Some testified that they had never seen Michael act violently, describing him as a hard-working man and devoted father. Others recalled Susan confiding about fear, bruises, or moments of intimidation. Each side selected the accounts that supported their position, and each reminded the jury that memory and perspective can shape how events are remembered. The jurors were left to decide which recollections carried more weight, knowing that neither set of accounts fully resolved the contradictions. Attorneys also focused on Susan's actions after Michael's death. The prosecution highlighted her delay in contacting authorities, suggesting this was evidence of planning and reflection rather than shock. The defense explained the delay as the result of trauma, pointing out that victims of abuse often act in ways that seem irrational when judged from the outside. Both sides used expert testimony to reinforce their arguments, with psychologists explaining how abuse can affect behavior and prosecutors pressing that the facts of the scene spoke louder than psychological theory. Throughout the trial, the mood of the courtroom shifted between tense silence and pointed exchanges. The prosecution returned again and again to the bindings, calling them the clearest sign of intent. The defense returned to Susan's own words, describing years of fear that had built to the breaking point. Jurors watched her testify, weighing her demeanor against the evidence presented. Every detail became part of a broader story, one of either premeditation or survival. Detectives who had worked the case also testified. They described what they saw in the bedroom, their impressions of control and containment, and their doubts about Susan's explanation. Cross-examination challenged these points, pressing whether detectives had overlooked signs of struggle or minimized evidence of abuse. This back and forth highlighted the central problem of the case. The same evidence could be used to support two entirely different interpretations, each plausible in its own way. As the days passed, the trial became less about new evidence and more about how to interpret what was already known. Jurors were repeatedly reminded of the photographs of the crime scene, the autopsy findings, and Susan's statements. They were asked to decide not just what happened but why it happened. The prosecution pressed that motive was anger and control. The defense insisted it was fear and desperation. With closing arguments, the divide between these stories became stark, leaving the jury with the task of reconciling them. For the jury, the decision carried enormous weight. They were not only judging Susan's actions but also choosing between two entire frameworks for understanding them. One framework cast her as a planner, capable of rehearsing and carrying out deliberate violence. The other saw her as a victim, responding with overwhelming force to years of abuse. Neither framework perfectly fit every fact, and both relied on interpretation. The responsibility to decide which version reflected the truth fell entirely on the jurors' shoulders. When the courtroom recessed at the end of each day, reporters gathered outside, eager to frame the case for a national audience. As the trial progressed, the story moved from evidence and testimony to headlines and labels. The media would soon take hold of the case, amplifying its most striking images and shaping public opinion. The next stage of the story belonged less to the courtroom and more to the media's hungry spotlight. As the trial gained momentum, reporters began gathering outside the courthouse, filing stories that quickly spread across local and national news. The case was striking not only for the violence but for the image of the accused. Susan Wright, a young mother with blonde hair and light eyes, was photographed daily entering the courtroom. The press gave her a label, the blue-eyed butcher. This name appeared in headlines, creating a sharp contrast between her suburban, motherly appearance and the crime she was accused of committing. For many, the nickname became more familiar than her actual name. Television segments highlighted the contradictions that fueled public interest. On one side, there was the narrative of a wife and mother who seemed gentle and devoted to her children. On the other, there was the story of 40 stab wounds and a restrained husband. Talk shows and commentary pieces emphasized these contrasts, often simplifying the case into a spectacle. The focus shifted from legal arguments to how the defendant looked, how she dressed, and how she behaved in court. Viewers were drawn in by the seeming impossibility of reconciling image and action. Reporters also repeated the most dramatic aspects of the trial testimony. The number of wounds, the presence of bindings, and the silence of the children in the next room were retold in detail. In some outlets, these facts were presented without the context of the defense's argument about abuse. This selective coverage shaped how the public came to see the case. While jurors were instructed to avoid media influence, detectives worried that the surrounding attention might still weigh on the proceedings indirectly. Detectives who had worked the case noted that their careful reconstruction of evidence often received less coverage than courtroom drama. The legal process required attention to detail, but the media leaned toward striking visuals and sound bites. The question of whether Susan was a victim or a planner was often reduced to simple labels, which frustrated those who believed the truth was complex. In interviews years later, some detectives expressed concern that the core of the case, the facts, were being overshadowed by the storytelling of television and newspapers. Outside the courtroom, the public response grew divided. Some people believed Susan's story of abuse and saw her as someone pushed beyond her limit. Others believed the prosecution's account and viewed her as a manipulator hiding behind claims of victimhood. These debates played out not just in news reports but in conversations in workplaces, homes, and community gatherings. The case had moved beyond the legal system into public judgment, where opinion often outweighed evidence. As the coverage intensified, Susan herself became an object of constant scrutiny. Her expressions in court were analyzed frame by frame. When she cried, some commentators said it was genuine grief, while others dismissed it as an act to influence jurors. The ordinary act of a mother worrying about her children became a point of commentary about image and motive. For detectives and attorneys, this level of attention added pressure, knowing that every move in court could be replayed and reinterpreted outside. The nickname Blue-Eyed Butcher remained a focus. It framed the case as one of contradiction and betrayal, something that fit neatly into television segments and magazine headlines. Yet it reduced the complexity of the marriage, the conflicting accounts of abuse, and the uncertainty of motive into a single phrase. This reduction may have shaped how the public remembered the case long after the trial ended. It also showed how media framing can change the meaning of evidence by emphasizing appearance over context. Inside the police department, some detectives worried that the noise of media attention could blur the line between justice and spectacle. They continued to review the evidence, preparing for cross-examinations and appeals, but they acknowledged that the public's memory of the case was being formed by headlines more than official reports. For them, the trial had become not only about what happened in the Wright household but about how society processes crime when it collides with image and narrative. By the time the trial ended, the media had cemented Susan Wright's place in public memory, whether fairly or not. For many, she would remain the woman whose appearance clashed with the violence of the crime. For others, she was a symbol of how stories of abuse can be ignored or dismissed once the spotlight turns to drama. The detectives who carried the case forward knew that the work was not finished, as questions about the marriage and its hidden conflicts continued to resurface. In the years that followed, reporters and investigators returned to the story, revisiting the relationship between Susan and Michael to see what might have been missed. Those revisits reopened questions of whether fear, anger, or calculation best explained the crime. What the courtroom and the media had fixed in headlines was not yet settled in the minds of those closest to the case. That re-examination of the marriage became the next chapter. Years after the verdict, the story of Susan and Michael Wright did not fade. Reporters, investigators, and even some members of the public returned to the marriage, hoping to understand what had been missed or overlooked. Interviews with friends and relatives reopened old memories. Some recalled small moments that seemed unimportant at the time but, in hindsight, carried warning signs. These included bruises Susan could not fully explain, sudden mood changes, and phone calls where she sounded frightened. For those who believed Susan's account, these details supported her claim of living under control and fear. Other accounts painted a different picture. Several people close to Michael insisted they never saw him act violently and found it hard to imagine him as abusive. They described him as attentive to his children and focused on providing for his family. To them, Susan's claims of abuse sounded like a defense strategy rather than a lived reality. Some even suggested she had staged certain images of injury to build sympathy. These disputes created two incompatible versions of the same marriage, neither of which could be proven beyond doubt. Detectives revisiting the case noted how memories had shifted over time. Some friends who once remained quiet began to share stories of arguments or outbursts they had witnessed. Others doubled down on their belief that Susan was manipulating the narrative. The effect was a fracture in the collective memory of the Wright household. What had once seemed like a straightforward domestic life had become a puzzle made up of contradictory recollections, each influenced by perspective, loyalty, or distance from the events. Legal experts reviewing the trial pointed out that domestic abuse cases often leave little physical evidence, making testimony central. Without consistent medical records or third-party witnesses, Susan's claims were difficult to prove. Prosecutors had used this gap to argue that her story was incomplete or fabricated. Defense attorneys, years later, continued to argue that the absence of proof did not mean the absence of abuse. This unresolved debate kept the case alive in appeal filings and in media retrospectives. Reporters covering the story again found themselves repeating the same divide. On television, some specials emphasized the brutality of the stabbing and the restraints, portraying Susan as manipulative and dangerous. Others gave space to domestic violence advocates, who warned that her case highlighted how abuse can remain hidden until it explodes into violence. Each retelling shaped the public's understanding differently, sometimes within the same broadcast. The marriage became less a single story and more a mirror reflecting competing beliefs about guilt and victimhood. For detectives, revisiting the case years later did not bring resolution. Some admitted that certain details still troubled them, such as the methodical bindings or the silence of the children's room that night. Others wondered if early signs of abuse had been too easily dismissed in the investigation. Even within the department, the case continued to divide opinion, a reminder that evidence alone had not silenced doubt. These private concerns rarely reached the public, but they underscored how unsettled the case remained. Susan herself pursued appeal after appeal, keeping the marriage and its disputed history in the spotlight. Court documents revisited the same allegations, sometimes adding new testimony from experts or advocates. Each appeal reopened the question of whether the jury had heard the full story. For those following the case, the repeated legal challenges reinforced the sense that the truth about the marriage had never been fully uncovered, that key parts of the story might still be missing. Meanwhile, Michael's family continued to speak about their loss, stressing that the focus on Susan's claims of abuse risked overshadowing his death. They argued that the evidence of the crime scene should remain central, not diluted by speculation about the marriage. This perspective kept attention on the brutality of the act itself, ensuring that the victim was not forgotten in the debates over motive and circumstance. Their position added another layer of emotion and complexity to the retellings. As years passed, the marriage of Susan and Michael became less a private story and more a case study in how crime and memory are reconstructed. Each telling reshaped the balance between guilt and innocence, fear and control, survival and calculation. The fact that no single version satisfied everyone kept the case active in documentaries, articles, and appeals. For investigators, lawyers, and the public, the marriage remained unsettled ground. With the past repeatedly revisited and the present still contested, the legal system became the next arena. Appeals raised new disputes over evidence, testimony, and interpretation. These challenges questioned not only the verdict in Susan Wright's case, but also how justice addresses family violence when proof is scarce and stories conflict. The stage was set for further appeals and unanswered questions. After her conviction, Susan Wright's case moved into the lengthy process of appeals. Her attorneys argued that the jury had not heard the full story of her marriage to Michael. They said critical evidence about abuse had been excluded or underemphasized during the trial. To them, this omission left jurors with an incomplete picture, one that focused heavily on the crime scene but not on the years leading up to it. They filed appeals on these grounds, asking for the verdict to be reconsidered. For advocates of domestic violence victims, this became a central point, that the legal system often struggles to balance physical evidence with the less visible patterns of abuse. Prosecutors countered these arguments by pointing out that the trial had been thorough. They reminded the courts that Susan had testified about abuse, and that the jury had heard her claims before deciding against her. They argued that the evidence of restraint and multiple stab wounds outweighed unproven accounts of violence in the marriage. To them, the appeals were attempts to reopen a case that had already been carefully tried. They believed the verdict should stand as the correct and final judgment. Appellate courts reviewed the arguments but were cautious in their rulings. Some acknowledged that the defense could have presented more detailed testimony on abuse, but they stopped short of declaring that this would have changed the outcome. Judges noted the severity of the crime scene evidence and emphasized the jury's role as fact-finder. For Susan and her supporters, these rulings were frustrating. Each denial reinforced the sense that her version of the story had not been fully accepted. Advocates outside the courtroom kept raising broader questions. They asked whether the justice system is equipped to handle cases where the truth depends on understanding domestic violence patterns rather than clear physical records. They argued that fear and intimidation can exist without leaving marks, and that victims often act in ways outsiders do not understand. Others, however, remained unmoved, insisting that the brutality of the stabbing and the presence of bindings could not be explained as self-defense. This dispute continued to shape public opinion long after the trial ended. Legal experts noted how appeals often narrow the focus of a case. Instead of retrying the facts, the courts examined whether proper procedures had been followed. For Susan, this meant her attorneys could not simply restate her story, but had to prove that mistakes in the trial had denied her a fair defense. This requirement limited what could be presented. Each filing had to balance technical legal claims with the broader narrative of abuse that Susan insisted was central to her actions. The tension between these two approaches made her appeals difficult. Over time, new testimony was occasionally introduced in hearings, but it did not shift the outcome. Some witnesses reinforced Susan's claim that she lived in fear, while others repeated that they had never seen Michael act violently. These familiar divisions mirrored the trial itself, leaving judges with the same competing accounts. The appeals process highlighted not only the challenges of this particular case but the limits of the system in settling questions of motive and experience. For the detectives who had first investigated the crime, the appeals kept reopening old questions. Some admitted that doubts lingered about what had really happened in the Wright home. Others held firmly to their view that the evidence spoke for itself and that the jury had reached the right conclusion. Their private reflections rarely made headlines, but they showed how unresolved the case remained even within law enforcement. The uncertainty of intent continued to shadow the file long after the conviction. The public's interest also persisted. Documentaries, articles, and televised specials revisited the appeals, often framing them as a test of how justice responds to claims of abuse. Some outlets emphasized Susan's ongoing fight, while others focused on the finality of the verdict. This divided coverage reinforced the idea that the case was not only about one woman and one man but about broader issues of family violence, credibility, and the fairness of the courts. For Susan, the appeals represented hope of a reduced sentence or a new trial, but they also carried the burden of reliving the crime again and again. For Michael's family, each filing reopened wounds, requiring them to hear once more the details of his death. The legal process prolonged the conflict, leaving neither side with closure. Instead, it deepened the divide between those who saw Susan as a victim and those who saw her as a planner. When the final rounds of appeals closed without overturning the conviction, the official outcome of the case remained unchanged. Yet the questions it raised did not disappear. How courts handle domestic violence claims, how evidence is weighed against testimony, and how justice can balance doubt against certainty were all left unresolved. These unanswered questions did not stay confined to legal texts. They lingered most deeply with the detectives who had walked into that bedroom in Houston and never fully left it behind. Their unease became the next part of the story. For the detectives who had first stepped into the Wright home, the images of that night never faded. They remembered the bedroom, the restraints on Michael's body, and the silence of the children's room just down the hall. Some described it as the most disturbing scene they had ever worked, not only for the violence but for the setting. A family home, outwardly ordinary, had become the site of a killing that carried signs of control as well as brutality. Years later, those images returned to them in detail, replaying in their minds long after the trial was over. Among the detectives, opinions remained divided. Some felt sure the case was one of deliberate betrayal. To them, the bindings and the number of stab wounds could not be explained as self-defense. They believed Susan had made choices leading to Michael's death, and that the evidence supported the jury's decision. These officers carried a sense of certainty, though it was a grim one, that the crime represented the worst kind of breach of trust inside a family. Others admitted that certain parts of the evidence never fully aligned. They questioned how exactly the events unfolded, whether the sequence could have been different from the reconstruction presented in court. Some wondered if signs of abuse had been underestimated or dismissed too quickly during the investigation. Their doubts did not erase the brutality of the crime, but they left open the possibility that the marriage had been more complicated than the official verdict reflected. These private misgivings showed how even experienced investigators could not find complete closure. The children's presence in the house that night remained one of the most haunting details. Detectives spoke about how the violence had taken place only steps away from where they slept. The fact that they were unharmed physically did not lessen the weight of knowing what they had lived through. For detectives, this reinforced the cruelty of the crime, whether it was premeditated or not. It was the aspect of the case that many said they could never forget, a reminder of how family violence reaches beyond the immediate victim. Time did little to lessen the impact of the case on those who worked it. Detectives recalled revisiting the evidence during the appeals, reopening files, and reviewing photographs that brought back the same questions. Each appeal reminded them that the story was unfinished in public memory. Even when the legal process ended, the case continued to surface in conversations within the department. It became a reference point whenever discussions of domestic violence investigations arose, shaping how later cases were approached. The case also tested detectives' understanding of motive. They had seen many homicides, but few that carried such a blend of personal closeness and extreme violence. For some, it stood as the cruelest betrayal they had encountered. A spouse killing a spouse in the shared space of their home. For others, the inability to fully settle the question of intent kept the case from fitting neatly into categories of passion, control, or survival. It remained suspended between them, never fully explained. Even when detectives retired or moved to new assignments, the Wright case was one they mentioned as unfinished business. Some carried the conviction that justice had been done. Others carried unease that justice may not have captured the whole truth. What they shared was the memory of walking through the bedroom door and seeing a scene that could not be forgotten. In that sense, the case left a mark not only on the courts but on those who had been called to investigate it. Over time, the story of the Wrights grew less about the details of evidence and more about what it represented. It became an example of how family life can mask hidden conflict, how investigators can struggle to separate truth from interpretation, and how even after verdicts and appeals, uncertainty can remain. Detectives carried these lessons with them, knowing that other cases would raise the same questions in different forms. The haunting of the detectives reflected the larger, unresolved nature of the case itself. Whether the crime was murder by design or survival after years of abuse remained debated, both in law enforcement circles and in public memory. For those who investigated it, the lines never fully cleared. Their unease echoed the doubts that surrounded the story from the beginning, doubts that no amount of legal procedure could erase. And so the case circled back to the question first raised in that quiet Houston neighborhood. Was the killing of Michael Wright an act of cold intent, or an act born of fear? The legal system had given its answer, but the truth remained tangled between testimony, memory, and evidence. To return to that night was to return to betrayal, and it is in that betrayal's echo that the story moves toward its conclusion. We return to that quiet Houston neighborhood, to the night when police entered a home that outwardly looked like any other. Inside, they found Michael Wright tied to a bed and stabbed repeatedly. The details of the scene shocked even seasoned investigators. From the very beginning, the question was not only who had carried out the act but why it had taken place in such a controlled and violent way. Susan Wright said she acted out of fear, after years of abuse. Prosecutors said it was planned, a deliberate killing disguised as self-defense. Between these versions lay the uncertainty that has never fully lifted. At trial, both sides shaped the evidence into opposing narratives. The prosecution focused on the restraints, the number of wounds, and the silence of the night. They described calculation and intent. The defense emphasized Susan's testimony about living with fear and intimidation. They said the violence of that night could not be understood without the weight of her past. Jurors had to choose between these two stories, each grounded in the same physical evidence but pointing to different motives. Their verdict settled the legal question, but it did not erase the contradictions. The media turned the case into a spectacle, framing Susan as the blue-eyed butcher. This label captured public attention but also reduced the complexity of the story. To many viewers, it became less about the details of marriage, trauma, and violence, and more about a striking contrast between appearance and crime. The nickname stayed long after the trial ended, shaping how the case was remembered. For detectives and advocates, this was troubling, because it meant that questions about abuse and motive were overshadowed by simplified images. Years later, when the case was revisited, friends and family described the marriage in different terms. Some recalled signs of fear, bruises, and a woman struggling in silence. Others rejected these accounts, insisting that Michael was not violent and that Susan created the story after the fact. The conflicting recollections left no single clear record of their relationship. Instead, the marriage became a mirror for debate about truth, memory, and the limits of what others can know about a private home. Through appeals, Susan's attorneys continued to argue that jurors had not heard enough about abuse. Courts acknowledged the possibility but left the conviction in place. Advocates said this showed how difficult it is for the justice system to weigh stories of domestic violence without physical proof. Others said the outcome confirmed that the brutality of the crime could not be explained away. The dispute stretched beyond Susan's case, raising questions about how justice handles family violence when certainty is impossible. For detectives, the memory of the crime scene never left them. Some said it was the cruelest betrayal they had ever seen. Others admitted that parts of the evidence never fully aligned, leaving them unsettled. The restraints, the silence, and the presence of the children just down the hall continued to trouble them years later. Their unease reflected the same tension that shaped the trial and appeals. A crime that could be interpreted as either murder or survival, with no way to fully close the gap. The Wright case left behind more than a verdict. It left a record of how law, media, and memory can shape a single event into different stories. It showed how two people can live in the same marriage but leave behind accounts that cannot be reconciled. It demonstrated how investigators, lawyers, and jurors must work with evidence that does not always fit neatly into one explanation. Above all, it showed how the most private spaces, marriages and families, can hide conflicts that only emerge in tragedy. In the end, what remains is not certainty but echoes. Echoes of Susan's voice describing fear, echoes of prosecutors describing planning, echoes of detectives standing in a room where love and violence collided. These echoes do not provide a single truth. They remind us of how fragile trust can be inside families, and how betrayal can carry consequences that reach far beyond those directly involved. The case of Susan Wright still haunts those who studied it, those who lived through it, and those who continue to debate it. For some, it is proof of cruelty and control. For others, it is an example of how abuse can end in desperate violence. For all, it is a reminder that some crimes remain unresolved not in evidence but in meaning. The Wright home may have been cleared, the trial completed, and the appeals decided, but the story refuses to end. And so we return to the question that first shook a quiet street in Houston. Was it murder, or was it survival after years of hidden torment? The law gave its answer, but the truth remains tangled. What lingers is the echo of betrayal, a family torn apart, and the haunting reminder that some crimes can never be cleanly solved,